They handcuffed him in front of his own house, claiming he didn't belong there. But just 2 minutes later, a judge stepped outside, and what happened next shocked everyone watching. The evening air was calm as David Carter pulled his sleek Blax sedan into the driveway of his mansion, a home he had worked tirelessly to earn after decades of study and courtroom battles. At 45, David was not just any man. He was one of the most respected defense lawyers in the city, known for standing firm against injustice. Yet on this night, none of that mattered. As he stepped out of his car, briefcase in hand, flashing police lights suddenly cut across the quiet street. Two officers leapt out of their cruiser, suspicion written all over their faces. "Excuse me, sir. What are you doing here?" one asked sharply, his hand hovering near his holster. David frowned in disbelief. "I live here," he replied evenly, nodding toward the massive oak door at the front of the house. Instead of reassurance, his words seemed to inflame their doubts. "This is a private property," the second officer said coldly. "We've had reports of someone breaking in." Before David could pull his wallet from his jacket, the officers moved closer. "Hands where we can see them," one barked. "Turn around." Neighbors began peeking from their windows, some whispering, others filming with their phones, while David stood frozen in the cruel irony of the moment. He, a lawyer who had spent his life defending others from wrongful accusations, was now being treated like a suspect at his own front door. He tried again, his voice calm but firm. "My identification is right here. You're making a mistake." But his words fell on deaf ears. Cold metal handcuffs snapped tightly around his wrists, pressing into his skin as one officer announced, "You're under arrest for trespassing." David's heart sank, not for himself, but for the small pair of eyes he knew were watching from inside. The eyes of his young daughter, forced to see her father humiliated on the steps of their own home. The flashing red and blue lights cast long shadows across the mansion's front lawn as David stood cuffed, trying to steady his breath while the officers gripped his arms with unnecessary force. His briefcase had fallen to the ground, papers spilling onto the driveway, yet neither officer cared enough to pick them up. "Sir, you're making a big mistake," David said firmly, his voice carrying the weight a man used to being heard in courtrooms. But out here, in the glare of suspicion, his words were dismissed as noise. "Quiet," one of the officers snapped, shoving him toward the patrol car as if he were nothing more than a common criminal. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalks now, their phones raised, murmurs filling the night with judgmental curiosity. Some whispered, "I didn't think he lived there," while others nodded silently, unwilling to intervene. Inside the mansion, his daughter pressed her face against the window, tears streaking down her cheeks as she watched her father being dragged away. David locked eyes with her for a fleeting second, and the pain in his chest deepened. Not because of the humiliation, but because he knew this moment would etch itself into her memory forever. As the officers forced him against the hood of the car, one of them spoke into his radio, "Suspect detained, possible trespassing, awaiting backup." The absurdity of it all burned in David's mind. He was not a suspect, not an intruder, but the rightful owner of this very home, a man who had earned his place brick by brick, case by case. His voice broke through the tension one last time. "I told you, I live here. Call your captain. Call your chief. You'll regret this." But the officers only smirked, convinced of their authority, blind to the storm about to break. The night air grew heavier as the officers tightened their grip on David, their radios crackling with static. Just as one of them reached for the car door to push him inside, the tall oak doors of the mansion swung open with a commanding force. A figure stepped out, his presence alone enough to silence the murmurs of the gathering crowd. It was Judge Raymond Harris, a man whose reputation in the city was unshakable, a figure of integrity known across courtrooms and news headlines. Dressed in a simple evening suit, his silver hair glinting under the streetlights, the judge walked down the steps with the measured calm of someone accustomed to authority. His sharp eyes took in the scene. The handcuffed lawyer, the spilled papers, the officers brimming with arrogance. And his expression hardened. "Uncuff him." "Now," Judge Harris said, his tone so absolute that the words cut through the tension like a blade. The officers froze, confusion flashing across their faces. "Sir, this man was trespassing," one began, but the judge's hand shot up, silencing him instantly. "Do you know who this is?" Harris demanded, stepping closer, his voice echoing over the hushed crowd. "This is Attorney David Clark, the man who argued and won cases that changed this very state's laws. He is not a trespasser. He is the rightful owner of this home. And you two just crossed a line that will haunt your careers." The crowd shifted, whispers turning into gasps as the weight of the judge's words sank in. The officers glanced at each other nervously, the certainty they carried only minutes before now dissolving into panic. David straightened, his eyes fixed on the judge, a surge of relief breaking through his anger. At last, someone with power had spoken the truth. The tension in the driveway thickened as the judge's words echoed through the night, leaving no room for doubt. The officers stood frozen, caught between obedience and humiliation, their hands still hovering over the cuffs that bound David's wrists. Finally, with trembling fingers, one officer unlocked them, the metallic click slicing through the silence like a verdict being delivered. David rubbed his wrists, the red marks stark against his dark skin, but his posture remained tall, his pride untouched. Judge Harris stepped closer, his eyes blazing with authority. "You've just committed a grave mistake," he said firmly. "Profiling a man outside his own home, in front of his child and neighbors. Do you realize the damage you've done?" The crowd murmured, phones raised higher now, capturing every word. The officers tried to speak, stammering excuses about suspicion and procedure, but the judge cut them off. "No procedure gives you the right to strip a man of his dignity without cause. And in this case, the only reason you saw suspicion was the color of his skin." His words hit the officers like a hammer, their faces paling as the crowd's disapproval grew louder. David stood silently beside the judge, his eyes scanning the onlookers, noting how some clapped softly in agreement, while others shook their heads in disbelief at the scene. For David, the moment was more than vindication. It was a turning point. This wasn't just about his arrest. It was about every injustice that had gone unchallenged. The judge placed a reassuring hand on David's shoulder and turned to the officers once more. "You will answer for this. And when you do, the entire system will be watching." The murmurs swelled into a wave of support, and for the first time that night, David felt the power of truth beginning to shift the tide. The following morning, the video of David's arrest had already swept across social media, igniting outrage and conversation in every corner of the country. News anchors replayed the moment the judge stepped out of David's mansion, headlines flashing with words like "racial profiling exposed" and "judge defends innocent man." Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, demanding accountability, their voices rising in chants of justice. Inside, David stood alongside Judge Harris, his head high, but his heart heavy with the memory of his daughter's frightened face. When the officers involved were summoned to explain their actions, the courtroom fell into a tense hush. The defense they offered was weak, flimsy, a string of excuses unraveling in the face of undeniable evidence. Judge Harris leaned forward, his tone cold and resolute. "You have not only dishonored your badge, but you have dishonored the trust the people placed in you." The officers lowered their heads, the weight of their mistake now undeniable. For David, the moment was not about revenge, it was about change. He addressed the court, his voice steady but filled with passion. "What happened to me could happen to any black man in America. But last night, it didn't break me. It gave me a voice louder than I've ever had before. And I will use that voice not just for myself, but for every man, woman, and child who has been silenced by prejudice." The crowd erupted in applause, the sound echoing through the chamber like a promise of change. As he left the courthouse, his daughter ran into his arms, whispering, "Daddy, you're my hero." And in that moment, David realized the true victory wasn't in proving his innocence. It was in proving that dignity and truth could never be handcuffed. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts. Subscribe to Blax Stories for more powerful and inspiring stories every week.